Greetings and welcome to the latest edition of the Entheogenic Evolution podcast. As always, I'm your host Martin, and I'm happy to have you with me today. For this week's episode, going to go ahead and wade back into what is, I'm sure, going to be a controversial issue for some folks out there. I'm having Ian Benouis back on the podcast, and he's also joined by Adam McKay. They're both joining me from the Church of the Sacred Synthesis, which was formerly the Church of Psilomethoxin. And as I'm sure many of you listeners are already aware, that they have released information from Adam's own scientific research into Psilomethoxin, claiming that they feel that there's pretty good evidence that they actually do have the molecule that they say that they have. Adam is the Chief Scientific Officer and Chemist for the church. He's been working on this research for the past year, and he has quite a bit to share here in the podcast. He kind of takes the bulk of the conversation because he's the one who's doing all the scientific research and work on it, and basically says that he thinks that there's a very good chance that they do have Psilomethoxin, and he's got all the scientific reasons for that. And I just want to remind the listeners that I myself am not a chemist. I am not qualified to make any kind of assessments over what is accurate or inaccurate or what is good science versus bad science in all of this, that I am a layperson, as I'm sure many of you are as well. And if you who are listening, if you are a chemist and if you want to take issue with it or raise arguments, that's fine, but you don't need to direct them at me because, again, I'm not a chemist. I cannot assess anyone's side of this. But I do think that it's something that's worthwhile reporting on. I think it's worthwhile listening to what Adam has to say, that he does present as being quite diligent in his research and in his work. And I think it's worthwhile to give them a listen. And they also are inviting collaboration in contrast to what the Church of Sacred Synthesis experienced last year, which was kind of sabotage and defamation versus collaboration. And I think that we could all use a little bit more patience and understanding and actually working with each other. So that's my plug for that. We'll get to the conversation in just a minute, but a couple quick announcements before we get to it. So looking forward on the podcast, coming up next week, we're going to be wrapping up our time with the audiobook for the Facilitating 5-MeO-DMT anthology. There are actually two appendices left in the book, but one is my conversation with Hal, which is still active here on the Entheogenic Evolution podcast. And I just thought that I would direct you there. If you want to listen to that, it was from back in 2022 before the book was actually released, but the conversation is still active on the podcast. So you can go back and listen, and we're going to skip ahead to the final appendix of the book, which is Appendix D, which is my chapter on theology versus entheology. And that's going to wrap up our time with the Facilitating 5-MeO-DMT anthology. Of course, if you want the entire audiobook, you can go find it at Audible, Amazon, the Apple iBook Store, and along with all my other audiobooks are out there as well. And of course, speaking of books, my new book, 5-MeO-DMT Integration, Embodying Non-Duality is Not What You Think, Education and Empowerment for Working with the God Molecule, is now available in paperback and ebook format, and also as a PDF with full color art available over at my Patreon shop, along with 17 other books, most of which have some full color art in them as well. You can stop by at patreon.com/Martin W. Ball and just go to the shop that's at the top of the page, and you can check out the PDF books that are available there for purchase and download. And of course, while you're there at my Patreon page, I would invite you to consider signing up as a paid supporter and patron. There's everything from $1 a month all the way up to $100 a month, which also gets you a 1-hour complimentary video call with me each and every month. And there's lots of ranges in between. And a reminder that if you start at the $20 a month and up, you get access to the full back catalog of the Entheogenic Evolution podcast that is exclusively available over there at my Patreon page. And your support is always appreciated, whatever level you are comfortable with. And there is no obligation. You can raise it, you can lower it, you can come, you can go. But I do invite you to consider becoming a patron, that I am an independent author, publisher, podcaster, musician, artist, photographer, everything I do is very independent, and I do rely on people supporting me in doing that. So I'd invite you to consider signing up over at Patreon. And you can also sign up for free if you want. But $1 a month is great. $5 a month is great. That's about a $1 donation per podcast episode every month. So lots of choices over there. And speaking of calls, of course, I am available for 30, 60, and 90-minute integration calls from a non-dual and energetic perspective. I'm going to be out of the office for the next 2 weeks, but if you want to reach out at martinwball@gmail.com or at nondualentheogenicintegration.com and shoot me a message, I'm happy to get you on the schedule for when I am back in the office in early April. Let's see. Also on my list is I want to give a shout out to Stephen Kirby at the Unchurched University, which has just begun its 5-MeO-DMT facilitation course. And I am very much looking forward to getting in on that, teaching 1 or 2 classes a month, and that'll be starting next month for me. But the course is already underway, so congratulations, Stefan, and I'm thrilled to be a part of that. My last announcement is that over this past week, I have been busy making some new music, which is going to go to supporting the audiobook for the forthcoming 5-MeO-DMT integration audiobook, which I will be making, sometime next month. I'll be starting to work on that, but I've got 6 new tracks available. If you want to check them out, they're over at my Bandcamp page at martinball.bandcamp.com, just listed under New Songs 2024, and I'll put in one of those new tracks here at the end of the conversation with Ian and Adam. Well, I think we're about ready to get into the conversation. Just want to let you know that we're recording from 3 different locations. So there's 3 different audio setups. So there are some variations in the levels of our various voices and a few transmission issues here and there. But overall, I just want to encourage you to listen with an open mind, especially if you're not a chemist. And if you are a chemist, maybe even have a more open mind and just listen to what Adam has to say. And one last reminder, I myself am not a chemist. I cannot make any assessments about any of the claims made here, but let's go ahead and listen. I think that Adam is very cautious about what he's trying to claim. He says that this is very good evidence. He does not claim that it is definitive evidence and that more research is needed, and he's proposing collaboration to help do that, which I think is great. So let's give it a listen. Here is Adam McKay and Ian Benouis from the Church of the Sacred Synthesis discussing Adam's research into the potential identification of the psilomethoxin molecule within their church's sacramental mushrooms. All right, here we go. I am very excited to have this conversation today here on the Entheogenic Evolution podcast. I'm welcoming back Ian Benouis and also welcoming for the first time onto the podcast Adam McKay. And both of you are joining me today from the Church of the Sacred Synthesis. And we've got some big news, or you guys have got some big news. So I'll let you guys start with the big news that I just saw references to. I think it was just yesterday when some official posts were made by the Church of the Sacred Synthesis. But yes, what is the big news that you guys have to share?
Thanks for having us on the show, and again, Martin, for me, and I'd love for Adam to tell people what he did and what he found.
Well, it's been quite a long journey, and we found some pretty interesting things. It started about a year ago. Believe it or not, I don't think I've told you this, Ian. I think Thursday was the 1-year anniversary of meeting the church and joining and deciding to embark on this mission.
Oh.
And in that timeline, we took about 3 months of planning, research, catching up on just about everything related to sacrament and tryptamine science in general, only to take another 6 months to start our initial plan, which required research. And when I say ground up, we had to build a facility from the ground up. There was a concrete slab and some solar panels above it. And that was it. There was only those 2 items. And then we had to make some walls. An electrician did come in. We have to follow code. But other than that, we had to build an entire facility ourselves and then make it into a laboratory. Once we did that, that took 6 months. And the past 3 months, we had to conduct the research. And boy, oh boy, has that been some fun research. found out quite a lot about this sacrament. And for one thing, the molecule, which for good reason has not been identified until recently in a natural setting, has a bunch of unique properties. We can get onto that in a little bit, but I've already probably spoken a bit too much before the next question.
No, that's quite all right, Adam. So the Church of the Sacred Synthesis, the sacrament, and this is, Ian, you were on, it was probably almost a year ago now that I had you on the show, and you were kind of the creative force behind all of this, and talked about adding 5-MeO-DMT to the substrate of the mushrooms and then having them grow and convert that into Psilomethoxin of the 4-HO5-MeO-DMT. And right around the time, and you've got the molecule there. Awesome. And right around this time, we had the Research Institute of USONA claim that they got a sample from an anonymous source or something like that. And they said that they tested it for Psilomethoxin and there was no Psilomethoxin in it. And then I think a couple other labs kind of jumped in and said the same thing. And then it kind of exploded on social media with your friends and mine, Symposia, coming in and writing up all these articles. And basically, the tenor out there was that the Church of Psilomethoxin or the Church of Sacred Synthesis, these guys are a bunch of frauds and they're deluding everyone, and they're basically distributing these bogus mushrooms. But now with Adam, we have confirmation of Psilomethoxin. So let's kind of talk about what happened there, and then we need, Adam, your input on how to do the science in such a way that actually it can be confirmed. And please treat me like a chemical idiot, because I am a chemical idiot. I'm not a chemist, and certainly most of my audience are not chemists. So when we see something like from USONA and they say, hey, well, look, we did this analysis, and you see this is where it should be, and there's nothing here. It's hard for people who aren't scientifically literate to know what to say other than, well, looks like a dud. So wherever you guys want to jump in on those topics.
Sure. Of course. And no one should ever say that they're a chemical idiot. At best, we might be some idiots full of chemicals, but most of us are not idiots full of chemicals, and everyone can understand in certain ways. So I'll start with actually the USONA paper, because I'm sure Ian has time and time again explained what the church is, what they do, and what the sacrament is. A one-sentence overview, of course, is 5-MeO-DMT is added to the mushroom substrate, and it makes Psilomethoxin inside the mushroom. They had believed it was biosynthetically. We now know that it is in there, and since no machines touch it, we're going to still assume it's biosynthetically. But the most interesting aspect about this confirmation that I'll get into detail is how deep does something have to really go for it to be confirmed? USONA looked for it and said it was not there. And now we've looked for it and saw that it is there, and then tried to make sure so there wasn't any doubt that we looked in different ways and had like another party look for it. And this may sound confusing, and is somebody lying? Is somebody just doing bad science, making mistakes, or hiding something? But that all comes down to what the heart of science really is methodology. The USONA paper, which is actually just, I believe, 2 pages, don't crucify me if it's 3, I forget. It's fairly short, so anyone can give it a look through. They use a method to test called UPLC mass spectrometry. It's just basically a really good HPLC and a mass spectrometer added on to separate everything out in the first part, and then the second part tell what each of those components weighs. You can run standards, and you can see what each of those things that you're weighing also looks like when you weigh the standard to get extra positive confirmation. But the problem is you can't measure something that never went into the instrument. So if I had cup full of A, B, C, and D, and I extracted A, C, and D without any B. And then I put my extraction with A, C, and D into a machine, and the machine was telling me everything that it was like in my extraction. It'd say there's no B, because the B was still in the cup. So they used methanol to extract what they thought was psilomethoxin and everything else, the mixture. And then they tested that extract, because you don't just shoot like mushroom powder into like these instruments. You make liquids and then they get injected like by microliter amounts. So of course USONA wouldn't detect it because it never made it into their instruments. And again, I'm not making a definitive claim on any of what they actually did. This is what I am concluding from their paper, and I'm not trying to make any assertion other than it's what I conclude by reading that paper. Mm-hmm. Again, I'm not trying to discredit anyone because that's a go-to solvent. Every like tryptamine analysis in the past with one substitution, like all the other ones besides psilocin, psilocybin, agaricin, baeocystin, norpsilocin, all tryptamine from fungi have been analyzed by a robustly proven method of methanolic extraction. It would be stupid, really, to them not to have tried that, to test for anything that has ever been tested before. But the caveat here is that this has never been tested before. This is not a single substituted tryptamine. This has two substitutions right next to each other. Now, this is where I'm going to not do any crazy advanced science, but remember that molecules are made of atoms bonded together. Those bonds are held together by electrons and orbitals that overlap, and quantum mechanics has to deal with all that. And suffice it to say that when you add more atoms and bonds, the general reactivity or chemical nature of the substance changes, not just by where you add that bond. Things around it become weaker or stronger. In this case, there's two substitutions on the tryptamine, which has a really electron-rich area. You've ever pictured a molecule, if Ian can hold it up. Great. You see that ring? And in the ring under its hand, too, it's not too important to see the other one, but there's two rings. Hold it by yep. But that whole system is alternating double bonds. They call it aromatic, and it's very electron-rich. Now, you have an oxygen. Oxygen also has, it does a lot with its electrons. On the 4 and the 5 position, now you both have oxygens. So trying to have two oxygens right there next to each other on this, that will change the chemical reactivity of this. And therefore, that hydrogen may come on or off easier. Every part of the molecule now has a different strength of bond between everything. Probably mild, it still holds together, but when we talk about the strength of the bonds, the most important one in this case is probably the hydrogen bond somewhere. So what's a good example of this? I'm sure in terms of many things, we've heard of free base and acid salt. Even the tryptamines do. Like DMT, for example, has to be in its free base form, which means that it has a hydrogen that is not there, removed. And that free base form is non-polar. It's soluble in oils, and people have vaporized that. Its acid salt form, clinically the fumaric acid, has a hydrogen given, but that would be an H+, and it so has to have a minus somewhere, the fumarate negative ion. And so the acid form is intrinsically polar and therefore soluble in water. All tryptamines have a property like this, and things like 5-MeO-DMT can be made as the fumarate fault or free base, and honestly, even the psilocybin and psilocin. Any molecule that can have it will do that, but they all have different strengths of their acid dissociation. That's a fancy word for how easy it is to take that hydrogen on and off. The long point that I've been circling around thank you for putting up with that, is because there's two oxygens right next to each other. It is my hypothesis that the acidity of that molecule is altered from all the other tryptamines. And at biological and like clinical pHs where we try and extract it, it might not have a solubility in water or methanol. Just because all the other ones are soluble in methanol at the pH that it is in its medium doesn't mean that this one will also have the same like pH necessities to be soluble in methanol versus water.
Okay,
and
so if I could...
I didn't think about this theoretically. I didn't just think about this and do it. And I'm still researching like the bottles to see if that even has any validity. So this is not something I'm hoping to be like called out on if it turns to be just like not true. It's my theory. But what I did do is I tried extracting it using every possible solvent and pH. I obviously used methanol and water and 50% methanol water and other solvents and combinations, and each one of those combinations or like single ones done at both neutral, acidic, and basic pHs. There is literally an array of that I have, like a test tube holding grid that just I organized by all the solvent combinations that I just extracted under all conditions and tested each one. And it turns out that anything with more than about 50% water and neutral gets a signal for Psilomethoxin. I didn't know it was a Psilomethoxin, a signal at the time of extraction using an HPLC, which has no standard like at that time. But I did get extra P. So that's when, of course, I then took what had things to be investigated further to a mass spectrometer. And then that mass spectrometer, that was a HPLC or LCMS is what it is. It's a single quadrupole. It gave me to 1 decimal place the 235.1 mass in like repeated samples, which prompted then to reserve time under the much more, precise instrument is a triple quadrupole. And those are the results that have been shared from the triple quadrupole LCMS. And that confirmed the presence of a molecule weighing 235.15.
Okay, so if I could
I'll stop there.
Okay, so let me just sum up a little bit. So going back to the point that really what it comes down to is methodology. And as you said, that there's this methanol extraction method that would just be the standard for analyzing materials to see what tryptamines might be present within them. So that's the laboratory go-to. So we're assuming that that's what USONA did, and perhaps the other labs that might have looked at samples of the Church's sacrament, that they'd probably be doing the same thing of going with methanol. But because we have these additions to that base molecule, that DMT molecule, we have an addition at the 4 position and the 5 position. You're saying that the potential of having these two oxygens close together like that could create a certain amount of instability within the molecule so that maybe it would get destroyed in the process of the methanol extraction, or that it wouldn't be extracted properly. So that then when those materials go into the mass spectrometer, as you say, if you're looking for A, B, C, and D, but B was never in the mix, that it's never going to show up in what comes out of it.
Distinguish between B being present like at the laboratory bench before you start, and whether or not you're saying B was present at the machine when you extract the machine test, like it's called aliquot or whatever. When you take what you're trying to test and make the sample that you're putting into the instrument.
So
the B could still be on the bench and not have made it into the instrument.
Right. So that, in other words, just because it didn't show up in the test doesn't mean it wasn't in the original materials.
Yes. Because again, they did not put any fungal like solid matter into an instrument. These are liquids that go in and they flow. And you have to create a solution.
Yeah. They proved a false negative, Martin, which we know you can't ultimately disprove the negatives. So they
the
didn't find
problem
what they were looking for.
Exactly, Ian's correct. And the problem that I see is everything until the very end of the paper, they tested by a certain method, which the method that everyone's always been testing for. They did that, with the professionality that an institute of their level should be holding for a test. And then they went at the very end and claimed, therefore, due to this test, there isn't any sacrament in the sample. The problem is, you have to say there's nothing in a sample, you have to check the entire sample. If there was still untested material that didn't go into the machine that was not in the methanol. So they reasonably, if this is an investigative new substance, like the sacrament, no one has really been testing that. They should have checked to see what's the soluble, obviously, in water, because if people are eating this, they're made of water, and whatever's soluble in water will go into the people. And honestly, just test with all possible substances, just out of curiosity. But they're not obligated to publish what's soluble in ether, But if I had that lab, I would have checked, as many different substances as possible, because a new thing. You don't know what you could discover until you try to do so.
And
Amen.
that's what you're discussing about then using water as the solvent, that apparently if you use water and then you do the rest of the methodology of, say, putting it into the mass spectrometer, then you're going to get a result.
Yeah, so you extract, it's just literally putting it in water and letting it equilibrate and dissolve. Well, it doesn't dissolve, but extract out, leach out whatever is soluble in water into the water. And then you take that water, put it through a very tiny filter, because particulates can't go into the machine. It's only liquid. And you put that liquid into the instrument, which I keep calling machine. It's an instrument. There is a difference. And the liquid gets tested. Whether the instrument takes UV absorbance after separating through some kind of a chromatographic column, which is just HPLC or UPLC, where it then goes into any kind of mass measurements. You have to put the liquid in, and the liquid has to be prepared. So the preparation with methanol was the reason that it did not show up in that or any other subsequent studies, as far as I've read, a couple of them. I'd like to see more if there are any. Every single one used methanol, which we're not hating on, because that is the real test for psilocybin and single substituted tryptamines. But this double substituted one appears to have different chemical properties. And I'd like to make some points about that more in detail after this topic has been further discussed.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Ian, is there anything that you wanted to add to this part of the conversation? You've been patiently sitting there.
Well, I just think that, we found we confirmed psilomethoxin in our sacrament through the molar mass, right, of 235.15, and we still can do more testing, third party and NMR and all that, which will further confirm what we already found. And then Adam can also talk about, we synthesized the reference standard that people were saying, how can you make any claims without the reference standard? How can you test without the reference standard? And Adam made that as well. So
then explain to us what that means, and what is a reference standard?
Sure.
Again, as a non-chemist, from somebody, because I think that was one of the things that came up with the USONAs, that, well, look, we say it should be here, but it's not here. And I know that was part of the response was, well, what is the reference standard? But so what do we mean by this for us people who are made of chemicals but don't know all the details of the chemicals, like me? I know I'm made of chemicals, but I don't know what a reference standard is. So could you explain that to us?
Yeah, go for it, Adam. Yeah.
Okay. Well, how do you know that when you measure anything, your measurement's correct? For example, how do you know that taking a ruler and making a measurement on that the ruler would give you the right measurement, assuming your skill is perfect? How do you know that the ruler reads right? And so you say, okay, the ruler company made it correctly. But how did the ruler company know how the ruler is supposed to be made correctly. And this is a chain problem that applies to any measurement of, any measurable quantity, weight, length, time. We have to have like an established and agreed upon set of standards. And this goes all the way to the top, to the literal like home of the world's standards. And they have a National Institute of Standards and Technology that, can say, oh, this is actually what a kilogram is. And they basically make sure that we're all in check. And just before I say anything incorrect, that I'm not a standards expert, I'm just going to look it up. The NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology for the United States. But there is an entity, I believe, somewhere in Switzerland, Ian, if you know, like global standard for mass. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, but that's a little bit off. Like in reference standards for these substances, when they made Psilomethoxin in 1965, Mark Julia's group at the Pasteur Institute, and when they made it, then it was oxidized at the end, so they didn't have a sample of it. So no one could make it again and be able to test it back against the reference sample they'd already created.
Yes, that's the end of that whole point I was getting at, and I paused in the beginning, but I got the answer for you. There's an International Bureau of Weights and Measurements, and they literally have what is supposed to be a kilogram. Like the world bases what a kilogram weighs on their like special preserved sphere made out of some metal that is exactly what it should be. And at that point aside, that's the intro. How do you know what a standard is? A standard has to be something that everyone agrees is correct. So when you make a new measurement, such as when now you take that ruler that somewhere in like the world agreed a foot is a foot, and then they told like the country, and the country told their these companies make rulers with the feet that are correct. The same thing goes for testing chemicals. You have to, according to the FDA, in like FDA like testing-based labs, like anything making pharmaceuticals, for example, if you want to test for any substance that they approve to test for, you have to use a standard that they approve is really a standard. And you have to get that standard from the USP generally, or else there are certain exceptions to this. And those are very strict regulations that, the FDA applies to pharmaceuticals. But so even here, you don't have to have a USP certified standard for, non-pharmaceutical needs, but to know what something is with certainty, you do have to compare it against something with certainty. And part of that, most of that, is why USONA did not have a standard at the time and checked the mass. And that's all you can check for if you're finding something for the first time. They looked for the mass, which it should be at that 235.1441, if I recall, in their paper. And they didn't find it. Of course, that's because methanol does not dissolve it. However, you can dissolve it in water and find it, and there we go. Now, I got off track because we're talking about standards. Once you have a standard, you can test for something using that standard. It's very easy. But making that standard is very hard, because how do you prove that there is no possible way in all universal exceptions that it couldn't be what it is? It takes extensive testing in every single way. And it takes much more than HPLC, anything with mass. Like, you have to do NMR, but then that's not even enough. There's X-ray studies. There's countless other studies to be performed. And even the study that we did, we showed that there really is, in all batches of the sacrament, we tested more than one, historically going back to as many as I could have. I think I got some from all throughout the last year, that there is a 235.15 substance, a signal weight, with a substance that gives a signal of that weight in all of them. That doesn't say it's Psilomethoxin, but it also says what else could be Psilomethoxin? What else could weigh that much? So it's very indicative and almost certain that it is this. Nothing in life goes 100%. but like 99.999 even is really great.
So if I could just step in here on this issue of molecular mass. So just correct me if I'm misunderstanding this or if I'm articulating this incorrectly. But by that, what like looking at, so the audience can't see it, but Ian is wearing his shirt. It says Psilomethoxin 4HO 5MEO DMT on it. So that is the purported molecule that we're talking about here. Now, as a molecule, it is made of very specific ingredients, and Ian is also holding up a molecular structure of the Psilomethoxin on the screen here. Now, every carbon or hydrogen or oxygen or anything else that's part of that molecule has its own atomic weight. And so when we put them all together, it's going to have a total weight. And so if I'm understanding correctly, that what you're proposing is that Psilomethoxin 4HO 5MEO DMT has a molecular weight of 235.15. Now, it's possible.
No, that is incorrect, sir.
Okay. Then go ahead and jump in.
Okay, so on the periodic table, it contains all the weights of each element, right?
Okay, yes.
Most people can agree on that, or just Google periodic table and it'll show all thousands of pictures which have all the weights of the elements. So those element weights, those are not exactly the weight of what one element would weigh. There are specific definitions. I'm pulling up a periodic table now just to make sure I say the correct number for any particular one. Pick an element, you guys.
Iron.
Okay, iron then. 55.845 is what is on the periodic table. So that is the average weight of an iron atom if you come across and have like a scale that weighs that atom. However, every individual atom does not weigh that at all. And that's because of isotopes. An isotope sounds like a fancy word, but it's pretty simple. It just means an atom is a nucleus with protons and neutrons, and there are electrons around it. Every element is defined by the number of protons, and when you have one is hydrogen, two helium, blah, 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 carbon has 6. And generally, it has 6 electrons, so it's carbon 12. Who's heard of carbon dating, for example?
Yeah.
You swipe left on nitrogen, swipe right on carbon. No, just kidding. Carbon dating is when you use techniques to measure something's age by figuring out how much of carbon-14 is there, decayed, etc. But what I just said, carbon usually weighs 12. Well, there's sometimes carbon-14. The number of protons defines the element, and the number of neutrons just are there neutrally to help keep bigger nuclei together, because believe it or not, positive protons would repel each other otherwise. Some carbon atoms are isotopes, or the same element, but with a different number of neutrons and the weight. So some carbon weighs more than other carbon. It chemically acts as carbon because it has the same charges, and so the electrons bond the same way, but it weighs a little more. Because of this, you can have like a molecule that, let's say, weighs 100 if all the carbons are carbon-12. But if one of those carbons is an isotope of C14, the same molecule would weigh 102.
Mm-hmm.
And almost every application ever, you're taking countless. Avogadro's number which is the number of molecules, and I say 12, number of atoms and say 12 grams of carbon is the definition, or give or take 6.02 times 10 to the 23. There's that many in just a gram. So you're dealing with innumerable amounts of these things. So statistics is dominant, and it really just means you get averages. So if there's 0.2% of all the carbon on the planet is C14, and almost all of it else is C12, then the average weight's going to be like 12.011, which is what the periodic table says. So that's why we get those numbers. Now, if you are trying to just eat, make, use, do anything but separate atom by atom or molecule by molecule, you use the average weight. That's why psilomethoxin has the molar mass of 234.299. But that is because in 10 with 23 zero after its psilomethoxins, you're going to get some of those carbons being isotopes. It was a long way, again, I thank you for putting up with all that background info, but we're at the answer now. That was a long way to explain that when you use mass spectrometry, you're getting signals one at a time. So if an isotope hits, it will hit at a different mass than another isotope. So you have to use something called the monoisotopic mass. And this is easily Googleable. Anyone can look up monoisotopic mass. And that takes into account the weight of it given the most common isotope. It's generally almost the same, but it is slightly different. And that is why we look for 235.15.
And so if I understand correctly, and of course, correct me if I'm wrong, with this number of 235.15, that there's the potential that we could get a different mix of molecules and atoms that might produce this. And so that's what we want to rule out. Is that correct?
That is technically a possibility. But however, since we go to 2 decimal places on the high resolution one, the chances of combinations of things adding up now to like the amount of numbers you can add up to make 235 is 100, 100, 30, and 5, 50, 100, right. 25, 25, 25, 30, and 5, right? A lot of combos. But once you start saying, well, you can only, it's made of carbon, so you can only add 12s and 14s and 16s for nitrogen and oxygen and 1s for hydrogen. So if you only add 12s, 14s, 16s, and 1s, how many different combinations of those can you even have as a whole to reach that number with the decimal place? And no matter how small or large that number is, there are much more complications beyond that. Let's say you get the right amounts of atoms. Let's say you get all of them. You get 13 carbons, 18 hydrogens, 2 nitrogens, and 2 oxygens. Well, that's the formula for psilomethoxin. It must be it. But psilomethoxin's 4-OH5-MeO-DMT. What if in this case that's 6-OH5-MeO-DMT or 7-OH5-MeO? Or really, you take any atom anywhere and put it somewhere else. It'll still weigh the same. So that is why the weight isn't enough evidence, but it is the evidence required. And it is strong evidence to show that it behaves as this molecule would and weighs as much as it should.
Okay. And so
I will remark about that 6 as well after you come back. I am dominating all the science talk here.
That's quite all right. So for the listening audience, what Ian was demonstrating for us as Adam was discussing all this is he was taking that 4HO, that's what you were moving, was the 4HO, and then he was showing, well, we could put it at the 4 position or the 6 position or the 7 position, right? And so we'd still have the same amount of material. And so technically it would be the same weight, but it would be a different molecule because where things are bonded is what determines what makes a molecule a molecule. That it's not just random, right? That the 4HO is at the 4 position. It's not the 7HO. And so that would potentially be a different tryptamine.
Now, that is exactly right. And that is not something I'm trying to assert, that the weight means it's that. In fact, I am excited to now start pursuing the next test after checking the weight is correct, which is nuclear magnetic resonance. It's a test similar to an MRI, but for atoms that can help elucidate the structure or positions of what bonds are bonded where. And it can resolve, the fancy word for moving the 4 to the 6 is called an isomer. It can resolve what weighs the same, but which isomer it is. I have already, though, attempted to address this in a way that's not confirmation, but useful. The reference standard that I had tried to synthesize did come out to weigh the same amount. But interestingly enough, and I had theorized this due to the way it was synthesized, it came out with 2 different products that both weigh this. And so I had made 2 of the possible things. I made the 6 and the 4. And they both did weigh correctly, and their signal did come up when testing against the sacrament to show that only one of them was present.
And so how were you able to do that test then? For
the same way, the test like on that image that was shown on the church website, the LCMS triple quadrupole. Not only was the sacrament ran, but then afterwards, the purported standard to see if it was the correct standard, if the synthesis had been done properly, was ran. And yes, it did show two separate things that came out at two separate times. The LC part of the LCMS kind of takes everything that goes in at once and isolates and puts them out one at a time. It's called chromatography. So two separate things came out that weighed exactly the same at different times. And then when the sacrament had gone in, which went in first, at the time, one of those two things came out afterwards was 235.15. So the sacrament has one of those two positional isomers in it, but not the other one.
Okay. So then also, I think you mentioned in testing this that you went back and you looked at batches from all the way back for pretty much a year. And so you looked at, so this has been being produced in different batches, and you went and you were able to confirm that there is definitely something there, the 235.15 position, or is that molecular weight? Am I describing that correctly? That's what showed up in all the samples?
The tests give something called an M/Z, and they use magnets to deflect something and that calculates its weight, etc. But essentially, that's just equivalent to other units like Daltons, or you could say AMU, atomic mass units. Without being too technical, you can use all those terms. Or unitless to say it weighs 235.
Or you just say it's the molar mass. You just say that number.
Oh yeah, the molar mass is term. Yeah, you could just say it's all those terms essentially are the same. When you're doing mass spec, you do want to use monoisotopic, but unless anyone's doing that, it won't make a difference to use all those words.
Okay, so now let's just imagine that USONA still has some of these materials around from that one little capsule that I believe they got. Now that you've laid out the science and the methodology for how to do this, could they go back and could they test their sample again? And could they even write a retraction of their original scientific paper?
Absolutely. I am surprised that they didn't retest it. I'm surprised they didn't reach out before publishing to say, hey, we didn't find anything, guys. Why aren't you, what's going on here? I'm surprised that they tested once and published that. Perhaps they only published one test and performed others. I don't know. I have respect for them. They are an institute, but it just seemed odd to me. And obviously, it's why I wanted to conduct my own tests. And now, of course, we're here today with these findings, and I'm hoping that way you can all move forward to discover more.
And of course, we don't have anybody from USONA here representing them. But just to jump on what you said there, Adam, that my original impression of the article that they wrote, that for one, I was surprised that they would submit a quote unquote scientific paper from an ultimately unknown source where they could not confirm that this actually did come from the Church of Sacred Synthesis, that they said, well, this was donated anonymously. And then, to only test one little sample, then to basically reach the conclusion that, well, we think they're frauds. We think that this is fraudulent of what this church is doing. I mean, those are very, very strong claims. And that's the view that, of course, was taken up by Symposia, because Symposia only wants to dig up dirt on people and say negative things and produce a negative social media buzz. And then that became the narrative of using words like frauds, fakes, just very negative language, rather than the more neutral scientific of, well, we tested a sample that may or may not have come from this place. We have not communicated with the source that supposedly produced this. We have not had a scientific discussion with anyone. So it just seemed to kind of prop up this whole kind of adversarial and sort of gotcha culture of, oh, look, we found somebody that we can say is a fake and a fraud.
I'll say one more thing before I hand this all over to Ian about the science. And just because of what you had said right now, I never want to be in a position like that. And so I tried to use the most correct words here, but I'll do an overall clarification. I determined a synthetic method and performed it that theory said I should have these two, like 6 and 4-OH, and then went and weighed it and found two things with the exact same weight. So it looks like it is at least worth looking further into that it is, though. Pretty solid evidence that, something there, and why would it not be that? And if it is, I'm going to have to find out why. So this is not anything definitive. This is not a publication, but there is now going to be more definitive testing to show that there's no way it couldn't be. Just in case anyone was trying to assume that I am definitively claiming all sorts of syntheses, 6-OHs, presence. It all looks pretty strong, but we will be continuing on with all the proper testing. And at that point, I do hope that anyone who has access to NMR testing and X-ray facilities would happily reach out. I'm Adam at Psilomethoxin.com. That's Ian at Psilomethoxin.com. We all would love to collaborate and really learn the truth about this. We got the first step, the strongest step, but there's always more.
Great. Thank you, Adam. Anything you want to add on that, Ian?
Wow. No, ask me more questions, man. That was a lot of science, and I get this is in our culture, man. We don't even spend the time to understand any of this, so no wonder USONA science wasn't good, and then a lot of people didn't understand the science and just repeated it. And then, but yeah, people like that other group you mentioned writing, they're people that are like that. They're sort of like incel posers that are masquerading as journalists, and that won't last very long.
Yeah. So from the organizational standpoint, Ian, I know that you're more involved at this end than Adam is, because Adam is the science guy. But let's just go back in time. Let's imagine that USONA actually reached out to the church. How might that have been dealt with at the time?
We were open. We wanted help to find out what was in there, and without naming any names, we'd already shared our sacrament with other people who had access at least to mass spec and hadn't been able to find it. But that didn't mean it wasn't there, and so we really. We asked other people in the community, and then no one was able to do it. So, if USONA had asked us out legitimately, you know what I mean? It came above table and like, we want to help you. We're working in the same kind of science. That would have been great. But they came at us out of nowhere and didn't offer us any courtesies. And then their timing was to publish their article like 2 days before entheogenesis. It's like, come on, that's everyone is just trying to ruin our party.
Yeah, that's really how it felt. And one of the things that came up in the USONA article, which for me was kind of an indication of, well, keep looking, that they did mention even there in their USONA article that there have been lots of self-reports by people consuming this mushroom sacrament and reporting novel experiences. And so that's where I fall into that category, that I had received some of the sacrament. I made a video of myself consuming it, and I said, yeah, this is definitely different than a regular quote unquote psilocybin magic mushroom, that I can definitively say from a phenomenological standpoint of what I am experiencing, this is something different. And of course, that's why Symposia wanted to be sure and get my name in the article that they wrote about the church, saying, oh yeah, this guy, again, because they already like to go after me. But that bioassay, of the sense that, look, we're going to figure out what something does by consuming it. That I know that certainly, Ian, you fit into that category. That's originally how this all came about, was by personal experimentation. And so USONA said that, well, then we tested to see were they adding other things, and so they went looking for other possible additives that might have been put in there, and said that they didn't find anything. And so then I think the ultimate conclusion was, well, so then people reporting novel experiences, that must all just be placebo or something like that, rather than asking the scientific question of, maybe there's something in the methodology that we could address that maybe can uncover. Because if so many people are reporting that they're having unique experiences, it kind of indicates that there might be something unique here.
Yeah, so they're just absolutely. So like Adam said, it's a basic failure of science, and then everyone can draw their own conclusions as to why they were determined to find a false negative, right? So if they were told at USONA to test the sacrament and find psilocin and psilocybin in there, that's exactly what they did. Everybody knows methanol will do that. So, and Adam wanted to find out. He had a curiosity. We're trying to find out. They wanted to disprove a negative, but it's a false negative report. It doesn't prove anything at all. And then they didn't do their, what did my son say? He said, it must really suck to be, doing the thing that you're supposed to be an expert in, basically completely failing at it. It's like, yeah. So they had a negative self-fulfilling prophecy that they realized. And then, people like the other people you mentioned, the so-called nonprofit news organization, they attacked you because they wanted to complete their character assassination in their cancel culture format. It's not even journalism. I mean, they're no. As an attorney, they don't have any protection under the freedom of the press. They're doing it's character assassination, like taking videos and chopping them up and slowing them down in timelines. It's like, SNL doesn't even have to do that. SNL, you just get on there and be funny and people laugh. It's like, I'm sure I could, the deepfake videos where you can have now the world leaders say anything for all the different words that they said. It's like, that's the kind of stuff that they're doing. And with this lawsuit, that very soon they won't be doing that anymore. I don't think they'll be. I think it's their last attempts at character assassination end with us and you, Martin.
Yeah. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that. So what, you are yourself a lawyer. So what's happening on the legal front? Because of course there were repercussions from scientifically non-conclusive materials being published, and then people running with that and creating a narrative. And again, using the words of like fake, fraud, charlatans. They're just trying to take your money, creating a narrative around it. Which is, that was something that I tried to address in the podcast episode that I put out after Entheogenesis, where I said, look, I can't speak to the science on this, but, if we calling the people who are involved with the Church of Sacred Synthesis as being frauds or charlatans, or that they're just trying to run a scam, that completely misses the mark of like who they are and what they're doing. That I do think it's important to actually not just characterize or mischaracterize people, but actually spend time speaking with them. Like, I don't know if any of these quote unquote reporters ever contacted the church to actually speak with any of you guys.
No, only people, without dropping names, right, they're possibly shared it with. But it's all about virtue signaling, Martin, and you've talked about this on podcasts before. Yeah. Everyone, you're the only person, in the 5-MeO space that stood up and refused to be kowtowed to the virtue signaling. And now that we have our data, all the other 5-MeO heads, right, that took our stuff, like the person who made this molecule, the inventor of the hyperlink in the internet, will have the cover to be able to come out now and say, I took Psilomethoxin 2 years ago, and I've been working with it since then. And so that's what we did. We gave it to the 5-MeO heads like you, so we could make sure. And everyone's like, 5-HT1A activity, 5-MeO, whatever's going on here, this is 5-MeO activity. right? And so we did our work that way before we started sharing it with everybody.
Yeah, and again, from the experiential standpoint, for me, I mean, clearly this was something different, and I thought it was worthwhile to report on and worthwhile to share. Again, not coming from a science background, that I can't say anything definitive about the science or the methodology, and that's why I'm really happy that we've had Adam on to share all of these technical details, and they are very technical, and that's the thing that
they
science.
And I apologize again about that.
No, that's what we want. We want because everything is so simplified within culture to be absorbed through media reactivity, right? That it's so much sexier. You can say, scam, right? And leave it there. So, no, let's talk about the science, and then let's also talk about the people. Let's talk about the motivations, and let's talk about the process of what's actually happening here. So, Ian, I don't know if you had a place to speak. Well, go ahead, jump in.
I was just going to say, I wanted to share an anecdote with you that I shared live when we were at Entheogenesis last year. And then it's that, and I've never shared this publicly, so this will, drop on your podcast along with all our other good news, is that I was on a call last year with William Leonard Picard, okay? If you believe the government's accounts, the inventor of 90% of the world's LSD, right? The missile silo guy. And on that same call was Wendy Tucker and Shulgin's daughter, Sasha Shulgin's stepdaughter. And so on that phone call that Greg Lake was on with us, a law partner, and right, he's no longer with the church to take on the lawsuit, but he's still, part of our crew. He was on that call, and William Leonard Picard looked at me and looked at us, and it was like a Zoom call, and said, "So you guys found Psilomethoxin, huh?" And I'm like, "Okay." And then he says, Sasha Shulgin and Peyton Jacobs, who's still alive, so people can now poke the internet, whatever, were playing the Psilomethoxin back in the day. And I'm like, these are psychedelic elders, right? I mean, like William Leonard Picard. I'm like, okay, I'm going to be on a call here. I'm going to have to ask you what he just said. I'm like, so wait, you just said that Sasha Shulgin and Peyton Jacobs were playing the Psilomethoxin back in the day. And he just looked at me like, okay. Yeah, and I asked him later, after that meeting, send him an email and say, hey, would you, anonymously or, publicly disclose this, right, what you said? And even so, if you had a date for it, that would be helpful. He didn't, reply to my email at all. And so I forwarded that email on to Wendy Tucker. And I'm like, hey, Wendy, I knew Wendy. We smoked DMT in Mexico back at Botanical Preservation Corps in Palenque in 1996. And I said, hey, what's your take on this? Was your stepdad messing with Psilomethoxin? And she goes, well, I looked at his book, right? And in his book, he didn't have it written in there. But once his lab got busted and he was paid his $25,000 DEA fine, he didn't write anything, but he wrote some breadcrumbs about Psilomethoxin, and he wrote some breadcrumbs about the enzymes that basically will make anything 4-hydroxylated, if it's a tryptamine, in TCAL. So he didn't write any more about drugs recipes, but he left some breadcrumbs for people to find. So in that way, sounds like Sasha Shulgin might be the first person that ever took Psilomethoxin.
Yeah. So now
I wouldn't be surprised as well. He was the first to take quite a lot of things.
Yeah, he said, Sasha said it was real, man. So we went looking for it to find out.
Yeah. So I have questions for both of you. And so on Adam's side, the question would be, so what comes next, scientifically speaking, and in terms of especially like sharing this data with other scientific institutes and getting more people to look at it? And then also for Ian, the question is, so what comes now for the church? Now that really this is a form of sort of public redemption, in a sense, that you're able to confirm that, yeah, it's what we said it was. Yep. And so we can move forward and kind of move past the scandal of the scam and the fakes and the frauds. And so whoever would want to answer first, but 2 questions there for the future. Yeah.
I'll just say one quick thing that I was hoping I was going to remember to say before. It is just as difficult to prove something is not there as it is that it is there. So no one can just go very easily with the test and say, nope, it's not there, no charlatans, unless they have like a purely true known, like no one ever doubts it standard, and be like, that's a standard, and it's not there because of that. However, you can't just say, no, it is there, but without like the same level of surety in the standard, which is not characterized like to the highest extent that is necessary. It is strong evidence so far, like, and we will keep going with that, but nothing is like more than 99% absolute. It is pretty damn certain that this active thing in the mushroom that has been detected, that weighs exactly what it should, and the synthesis that should make this, and then weighs the same as that, and even has the side product that was theorized that also weighs the same, and that was there. All this is strong evidence, but it is not definitive to the highest degree, but it is hell of a strong. So
and that
just to clarify that out there.
That will come, Martin, with the NMR, which is basically like,
exactly.
Right? It's shooting waves. It's shooting basically like, waves to the atoms, and then how they bend, right, tells you what position they're in. So even though you can say, well, it might be the same weight, right, based on that bond in a different position, but this is going to be able to tell you, where the stuff's located by the NMR is going to tell you the layout of it. There you go. It's going to tell you the stereochemistry of it.
Okay,
right?
so
go on.
So there are steps that can be taken to further along this path of confirmation.
Yes.
And as Adam is saying, that this is not 100% definitive. This is excellent information. This is highly suggestive information. And it sounds like it'd be very unlikely for it to be something else. But there are still steps that can be taken that we can further investigate this scientifically, hopefully dispassionately, like, again, not trying to prove a negative, not just, I want to prove that these guys are wrong, but actually with that open scientific inquisitiveness of, let's see what's really here, let's see what we can confirm, because that is the nature of science, that if just one person proves something and nobody else can show that thing, well, that's not science. Science is about replicability, about confirmation, and about testing, and about agreements about what standards are met and how we measure things, and all of that's what science is. Science is not just, we tested one thing and now we gotcha. Story's done.
Yeah, amen. So you wanted me to kind of talk about where the church is going. So the church has a couple partners that are going to help us allow psilomethoxin to be an active molecule that can have GMP standards and enter the stream of commerce over the counter while in clinical trials towards an FDA indication. That's the whole bind all the psychedelic companies are in. They can't work with them off schedule, and they can't be considered medicines until the FDA approves them. So the whole time we're waiting, they're off-limits Schedule 1 drugs. But things that aren't on the schedule don't have to conform to that. So just like Kratom could get an FDA indication if it wanted to, or Delta-8, it's the same thing for psilomethoxin. So the church has a biotech partner that's going to make psilomethoxin in yeast. We have a distribution partner that's going to be able to distribute the pure molecule. And then we have a university partner that'll allow us to be able to start doing the clinical trials right away so that we can do all that science towards an FDA indication. And whether we get it or not, we'll have all the scientific data that will keep the government from being able to overregulate something that's not on the schedule, and then try to, because it's not on the schedule, try to make extra rules for it. The current schedule doesn't work and the current rules don't work, so we don't need to create new rules. And when the government backed off, it was a year and a half now, of the 5 scheduled tryptamines, right? We talked about this in the podcast, or anyway. So whenever it was, they did that. That was a signal to us that the drug war was going from the government being on the offensive to now the defensive, because people stood up against any kind of analog act enforcement. And they said, no, So they snuck 5-MeO DMT onto the schedule right? You didn't know about it. I didn't know about it. They did that, saying it was like DMT. And then now they're like, now we got to make 5-MeO MIPT illegal. And when we stood up, we were part of the suit fighting that. And people like David Bronner went up there and, protested. The government's like, no, I'm not going to touch that. And we're like, wow, Psilomethoxin is further away structure activity from 5-MeO than 5-MeO MIPT. So we're like, okay, that's the green light that the government, thank God, doesn't have an appetite for stupid analog act enforcement. Authored by the way, President Biden. He's the co-author of the Analog Act with Strom Thurmond. Yeah, and so we're like, we got something that's useful that's not on the schedule. This is a gift, and this is so if it's helpful in the therapeutic context. So we have to have you have a church because you have to encapsulate your religious sincerity to protect the government interference, right? And then you have these other business partners, these other enterprises to keep other corporations from ripping your shit off and trying to commercialize it in a way that is not getting the medicine to the people.
And so how about from a PR perspective? Is there anything that the church is planning that, I saw the announcements that were on Facebook and on Instagram, and it also had, I think, an email that said press at Church of Sacred Synthesis, kind of inviting people like, look, if you want to ask questions, but here's the results of our scientific analysis. So is the church planning anything beyond that in terms of making this known? And again, because there was so much negative press and because we all know negative press spreads much more easily and much more quickly than anything positive or anything neutral. So is there any specific plans to counteract that or to address that?
That's a great question. So let me say this. I've always been a believer. I knew Psilomethoxin is real because I knew Joe Congarts was real, and he had patents on the stuff of phosphorylating and 4-hydroxylating, DET, DIPT, and DPT, right? And now one of those is a patented substance that different drug companies are fighting, the 4-OH DIPT. So I'm like, this is no big deal, man. These enzymes do it. So we have all the proof, is what Adam's saying. The last step is the NMR, right? That, and then we already have other third-party mass spectrometry confirmation lined up. And then, like Adam's saying, though, William Leonard Picard said at the MAPS conference, these new psychedelic startups, referring to us, you need to help them, and so NMR, if you got NMR, come help us and be part of this discovery together and be part of that 100% confirmation that everyone wants. But we can't find people to help us, which is why we had to build all the lab ourselves and do all the stuff ourselves and realize there's a whole, community of corporations with these DEA schedule and licenses and, where you can access these machines. And it's very hard to get into. I mean, Oakland Hi-Fi was lucky during COVID, right? A lot of these companies went out of business and they were able to buy some machines and stuff. And we've done the same kind of thing. But we're still at the point, within the next couple of weeks, we'll have an NMR test or we'll have an NMR machine ourselves. You know what I mean? Because people will, now that, these other people are done slagging us, we can get back to where we were with some good numbers that can help, our church run. And I mean, we had people, Martin, just like at the end of their ropes, man. Like my bank account went down to zero. I put over $100,000 in this church, and we've all been basically paid nothing. I didn't. Yeah. So anyway, so I'm just saying the haters don't even know what they're talking about, and we're just happy. We wanted the church to be able to spread the medicine, and now we'll either have to help other people on the NMR or we'll do it ourselves. But see, again, we still have to have this third party bullshit, right? It's like. How many tests do you have to have somebody confirm? So we'll all have this within a month, right, Adam? That sound reasonable? I mean, we're gonna, whether we have it ourselves or someone else does it for us, and beyond NMR, there won't be any more tests to do, right, Adam? Unless we're gonna do like X-ray.
Crystal we should be doing X-ray, but there's only so many tests. I would say definitely under 10, likely under 5. 2 might even be enough. The X-ray and the NMR. Obviously, little things like melting point and such, just to characterize fully a new substance to go into the databases.
Martin, I'll say to you, man, we want help. We want help. We had a good image. We never tarnished our own image. We never, we never lost our faith. And now we're redeemed, and we're suing the people who defamed us and then the people who piled on with that, because this is the only way to teach people a lesson. And they took our money away. They took our livelihood away, where we're helping other people. A bunch of us are, combat veterans, right? Disabled. And they're like, thought that it was like cool high school to, try to do some cancel culture on us. But, they tried to bury us with their bullshit, but we were spores and we fucking grew through that shit. And oh, by the way, that manure had some flowers grass in it. So, you had that psilomethoxin naturally occurring substance in the fruiting bodies. So.
Excellent. And Adam, how do you see your role with the church moving forward now that you've kind of done this heavy lifting with this initial research? But what's next?
Well, what's next, obviously, is carrying on with the proper studies that any novel substance would get, characterization and exploration. And there's just so much already to that I'm excited for the future. This getting set up was probably the hardest part, being able to do this sort of research without having, a facility such as any major institute or university. That hurdle, has been overcome, but we're happy to have people who are sincere and skilled in these areas to come further the research and learn about this and explore it further.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for sharing your time with me today. And Adam, I believe you're still trying to get to Texas to join Ian, but I really appreciate both of you taking the time. And thank you, Adam, for going through all the science and all the details. And again, if people want to reach out, where should they reach out to either help out or continue on with the scientific work?
Yeah,
Adam or Ian at Psilomethoxin.com.
Okay.
Yeah, Martin, if I could just have a last word from us, I'll share another tidbit from that same phone call with William Leonard Picard. This is the guy who predicted the fentanyl crisis, right, 20 years ago. And he himself is one of these top 6 chemists in the world, along with Shogun and Hoffman and whatnot. And he said there's going to be 10,000 tryptamine analogs in the next 18 months. This was, 6 months ago. And that's going to come from yeast. So that's the biotech revolution. That's where all the psychedelics are going to come from. The psilocybin genome's been mapped. And once you start crossing kingdoms and start to bring in xenosynthesis of using similar but overlapping and related biosynthetic pathways, then with gene editing and using yeast, you can make anything you want to make.
Wow, that sounds exciting.
Yeah, that's for us 6 to 12 months away. Being able to have psilomethoxin from yeast is probably realistic expectations.
All right. Well, it's been a pleasure to be on this journey with you guys. That we've kind of been in it together, because we all got roped into the public defamation that was happening at the time. But I'm glad that you guys have stuck with it, that you have really pursued the science, that you have prioritized the pursuit of truth and also the sharing of that information, and wanting to collaborate with others outside of the church, that this is not just an insular thing, but you are looking to actively collaborate and have confirmation. And, hopefully places like USANA can maybe take a little lesson in humility and maybe some decency of human interaction, to maybe reach out next time. Don't just prove a negative and then take glee in putting others down, which, given the timing of their paper, it's not like they were like gleefully saying, "Oh, we've got them" in the paper that they wrote. But given the timing, it's certainly very suspect, and it doesn't seem very compassionate from that end. And so let's all be human to each other, and let's do the science together, because science is a collaborative process ultimately. So thank you guys for doing the work, for persisting, and thank you for sharing everything you've shared today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Martin.
Appreciate you so much.
All right. Well, you guys have a good night and enjoy Texas. Are you in the smoke-filled zone in Texas, Ian, or is the air good there?
Apparently, yeah. No, I don't. That's not. Those are north of here. So,
okay.
Yeah, it's beautiful here in Austin right now. The bluebonnets are popping. It's incredible, actually.
All right, beautiful. Well, I look forward to coming back to Austin someday.
Entheogenesis 2024. We're gonna do it. Don't know when, but it's gonna happen, God willing. We want you back. We want you back.
All right.
Absolutely.
Love to. All right.
Next time, I swear, no crazy and lengthy details about science. It's just to get the whole picture out there at first. Thanks for following along.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Adam. Really appreciate it. And thank you, Ian. You guys have a good night.
All right. Peace.
All right.
Good night.